Okay, we think we're going to get started, and if one or two other people come in, I'm just the warm-up, so that's fine. They won't miss the important bit. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Anne Shepherd, and I'm simply here to introduce our speaker this evening. Just one practical thing, which is that the lecture is being recorded with Panopto so that we can make it available on the podcast afterwards, but clearly you all need to be aware of that, and the plan is to keep the recording going through the question period, which Michael Gold is going to chair. So thank you all very much for coming out on such a horrible wet evening, and we're really pleased that Dorothy Bishop's only able to come and talk to us. Dorothy is she's the professor of, let me get her title right, she is the professor of developmental neuropsychology at Oxford. She has, I think, the rare distinction of being both a fellow of the British Academy and a fellow of the Royal Society. So that means she kind of spans different disciplines. She's also a member of the executive committee of the Council for Defence of British Universities, as I am. That's why I'm standing here. And she's going to talk to us this evening about metrics. So the title is What Are Metrics Good For? Reflections on REF and TEF.
Thank you very much, Anne. And it's a great pleasure to be here, and I am enormously impressed at how many people have turned out on such a disgusting, vile, cold, wet night. So thank you for coming. And it's a great pleasure for me to talk on this topic, because most of the talks I give are on neuropsychology or other things like that. So it's quite good to have a chance to really, as I said on Twitter, fulminate about the REF and the TEF, which I have talked about quite a lot on my blog, but not so much in talks. Let me say a word first of all, though, about the CDBU. So it was started only in 2012, and this is from their website, saying that this is a sort of general ethos of the organisation, that universities in the UK are under threat, and there's a series of reforms has made universities more like businesses, subject to market forces, and we believe that these changes to the way universities operate and are governed pose a risk to a university's central function, which is to gather knowledge, free from interference, and to educate people in the skills they need to think critically and independently. I wasn't around at the start of the CDBU, but I actually got very interested in joining them around the time that King's College London were making a whole raft of people redundant, largely because of these sorts of principles of, they were not a sort of strong business case for these people, so they were all going to have to go. So I've been involved and keen to try and have some influence to sort of stem the threat to the universities. I'll just give you an overview of the structure of the talk. This is very helpful. If any of you fall asleep, you won't miss the key messages. I'm going to talk a bit about the history and nature of first the REF, the Research Excellence Framework, then the Teaching Excellence Framework. And with both of them, I think we need to step back and ask, what are we measuring and why are we measuring it? And what I'm actually going to conclude, very controversially for many people, is that we should ditch league tables, which I think are not useful for fostering a diversity of higher education institutions, which is what we need. I think the REF just needs to be radically rethought and simplified. I think the TEF needs to be strangled at birth. And I think the important message is that academics need time and security to do a good job, and that all this focus on continuous evaluation of everything we do is actually antithetical to doing a good job. So that's really where I'm coming from. But let me not just fulminate, but try to do so from an evidence base and from an academically informed point of view. I'll start, for those of you, I know some of you in the audience are young, I am old enough to predate the REF. I remember a golden age when there was no REF and we just got on and did stuff. But of course we need to have a mechanism for distributing public funds for research to universities. And what we've had in the UK, really since before 1965, since around 1911 I think it started, is in effect a dual support funding model, which means that universities get some money from central government in what's called a block grant, which is just sort of a big wad of money. They can do what they want with it, but the goal is that they should have money to do things that require long-term investment. So this will include staff salaries and things like libraries, laboratories, and so on. And universities need that sort of funding for continuity and long-term planning. But then you've got, on the other branch, you've got the research councils dispensing funds for particular grants which are peer-reviewed, and money is given out in a competitive fashion to them. And the money doesn't come directly from government. Right back from when this system was first set up, the funds were distributed by something known initially as the University Grants Council. And the idea was that a civilised society needed a buffer between government and the universities, because what you don't really want is government dictating what happens in universities. In fact, only last week there was a story from Australia that people from government had actually intervened in determining which research grants funded by the Australian Research Council were going to get funded, and decided that some of them didn't sound very interesting or sounded perhaps politically sensitive, and decided that they shouldn't get funded. So we have a system where that shouldn't actually happen. Now, yes, this is going to distract you, but it's rather wonderful. This is something, as a psychologist, some of you are psychologists I suspect, this is the Thatcher illusion, which is a very well-known psychological phenomenon that was discovered by accident, which is that if you invert the eyes and the mouth of a person, you don't notice anything odd about the face if it's upside down, but it looks really scary the right way up. I mean, some people think Thatcher was scary even without her face messed about with. But what she did do in 1981 was to start questioning whether this entire sector was adequately efficient and accountable, so that she wanted to have more direct government involvement in how the money was being spent. And she decided that we had too much money, the government should cut the budget to the Department of Education and Science. And and of course, because we had this buffer, we had the University Grants Council, it was up to them to decide how this was going to be played out, and they basically had the choice between deciding that the misery should be shared between all universities or that there should be selectivity. And they went for selectivity, and of course what happened was that the elite old universities were protected, but there were really bad hits to some other places, particularly Salford, Aston and Bradford, and some departments had to close. And there was a lot of kerfuffle, there were strikes, there were all sorts of things going on at the time. Then, after that, the Universities Grants Council realised that they really needed a rational basis. If you're going to make difficult funding decisions in this sort of way, it was better if we had some sort of system for deciding where the money went and who should get it and who shouldn't. And this was the birth of the research assessment exercise in the late 1980s. And the idea was that this block grant was going to now be awarded much more in line with rankings on this selectivity research assessment exercise, whereas previously it had been largely dispensed by some formula that nobody actually could tell you what it was, except that Oxford, Cambridge and London should never fail. This was sort of okay, except that the whole thing was thrown into complete disarray in 1992 by the Further and Higher Education Act, which just at a stroke almost doubled the number of universities. And this was interesting because this was a change that there wasn't a lot of discussion about the implications of it. It was just decided that polytechnics, which previously had been higher education institutions which didn't do research but taught people in courses for more sort of practical ends, that they would be awarded university status, and so they were now also eligible for this pool of money that was going to be used for research. And so this really created even more of a crisis and it concentrated people's minds as to exactly how this money was going to be dispensed. And at the same time, we were having this shrinkage of the block grant. An increasing proportion of the university's research income was coming from the research councils. Some people said, well, maybe the solution would be to have all the money just given to the research councils. But if you bear in mind that people do need in universities to keep going quite big and expensive bits of equipment, laboratories, libraries and so on, the need for a block grant is still very much there. Now, what happened over time from 1994 onwards is that there was this refinement in this research assessment exercise, which then started to be called the Research Excellence Framework. And we now have it in pretty much its current form. So there have been several iterations at intervals of about 6-7 years. And in each one, each university will submit information about research activity in given areas over a period since the last assessment. And this will include outputs, which tend to be books and journal articles, unless you're in the arts, which in case they may be pieces of artwork, for instance. But information on the research environment and information since the last ref, there's been included research impacts, where you're supposed to demonstrate that the research isn't just consumed by other academics, but has got some purpose in life. And then this information is assessed by a discipline-based panels of academics, and they're supposed to assess it in terms of originality, significance, and rigor, and use this 4-star scale from world leading at one end to recognise nationally at the other, and sort of make these difficult distinctions as to whether something's world leading or internationally excellent but falling short of the highest standards of excellence. So everything is evaluated in this way, and this is quite a large and complex exercise. Now, I'm going to tell you what's wrong with this, but let me explain why it came about in the sense of what is good about it, because of course it's not an unmitigated evil. And some of the good things about it are that the system is reasonably transparent. So if I want to find out, as I do, being the sort of nerdy person, I want to see the facts and figures behind it, I can go online and find most of what I need to find about the scoring of, for example, the last or indeed the previous ref and RAE. And if you talk to people from certain European countries, they think it's a wonderful system, because what it doesn't allow for is the sort of nepotism, political interference and so on that you get in other places sometimes, where whether you get a job or not might depend on who you're married to, for instance, or who you vote for. So it's important to bear in mind that these are potential advantages of having this particular system, which is very complicated, but where it's not really easy for somebody to come in and sort of cut across it. And you could also argue that because it puts emphasis on having people who do a lot of good research in an institution, that it will encourage the development of careers of what one might call the rising stars. Again, this is something that in some countries, you talk to people from Germany, they say that you get very blocked if you're trying to sort of make progress in your career by this sort of layer of senior people. This has encouraged junior people to get promoted and so on. It's been adapted to allow for things like career breaks, which otherwise could be problematic. And it's generally been regarded, certainly when first introduced, as a mechanism for getting rid of this sort of person, dead wood. And one could argue that people like this are increasingly rare in our universities, but at the time the RAE started out, this was a sort of parody view of what a lot of academics were like, and I think there's still quite a lot of people in government that think a lot of academics are like this, in the sense that they are sort of bald old men who are very bad at teaching and make their teaching opaque so that the students don't come because they don't really like teaching, and they're no good at research, and that if you give them an administrative job to do, they'll do it so badly that they'll never be asked again. And clearly people like that are not going to really survive in a very competitive system. There's claims that on top of these other advantages, that the ref has transformed British research and made it so much better, because it's incentivized us all to do much better research. And the evidence for this is that there have been improvements in these 4-star, 3-star, 2-star rankings. So across all submissions, the percentage regarded as 4-star is up 14% between 2008 and 2014. And then again, 50% were internationally excellent, 3-star, up from 37%. Whether you think this is sort of strong evidence for research improving, I mean, I suppose it would be worrying if everybody looked as if they were getting worse, but at the same time we have people saying if this happens across student degrees that it's just grade inflation. And I have to say my personal take on what's happening to research in my field and in basic biomedical sciences is that it is not getting better. It's getting, in fact, I would say getting worse. And I've got a whole other talk on what's known as the replication crisis, and the fact that scientific work seems to be becoming rather unreliable because we're all running around trying to publish sexy papers in a much less careful way than we used to. So I'm not sure that there is really this improvement, but it's hard to know because, of course, how do you measure the improvement? But what are the disadvantages? I like talking about the disadvantages. They're not talked about enough, I think. And I was very encouraged when I went in 1998 to a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, as it then was, and Colin Blakemore gave, he was the president that year, and he gave a speech. So this is 20 years ago, but I think he hit the nail on the head. And this was for me, as a relatively younger person, really encouraging that somebody as senior and important as Colin Blakemore was pointing out something that seemed very obvious to me, but which somehow vice-chancellors and the powers that be didn't seem to grasp. And he said the main criticism of the research assessment exercise was the cost effectiveness. So they reckon that the people administering this thought it cost them about £4 million at that time. But the point he makes is that that's a financial cost to what was then HEFCE, this buffer zone thing. But the cost to the universities is much greater, and it's not just financial cost, it's cost in time. It's cost in tying people up, particularly if they're a panel member, but even if they're not, in sort of ticking these boxes and doing everything to try and improve their ref rating. And the point he makes is that, okay, this is all very well, and in fact, I think in the course of this speech, he said the first time you ever did this exercise, that was quite useful perhaps for establishing what research was going on where and how well it was. But the point he's saying is that the changes in ranking from one exercise to the next are really not that great. And so his idea is that what we're doing is putting in a huge effort and cost to discover less and less, because we're not really making a lot of change year on year. And I think that this point that was, I liked this speech so much, I wrote to Colin Blakemore and said, can I post your speech on my blog? And he said, oh, if I can find it, and he dug it out. And it is now there for posterity, because I think it was an important point that was being made at a time when few people were making it. But I think it still stands today. What we have here is from the REF 2014 website, from the government, or from HEFCE, I think actually this one, and they sort of are boasting almost about all the things that happened in the REF, and they point out that they looked at 191,150 research outputs, and that they had panels that included nearly 900 academic members and 259 research users. And you can say, okay, that's great, except when you do the sums, you've got, if you just had one panel member for each of those outputs, you're looking at 213 per panel member, and then assuming that you want some double marking, people are looking at a huge amount of stuff. And some of these outputs are journal articles which you might be able to evaluate reasonably quickly, but some of them are books. And so you're talking about people evaluating tons and tons of stuff, and this will bring us to a point I'll emphasise more later, which is to do with, is this really peer review? What is it? It's going on incredibly fast. It cannot be at a deep level, however committed the panel members are to trying to do a good job. Those panel members I know are committed and try very hard, but it is a killer. So could we simplify it? So I thought about this over the years and blogged about it quite a lot, and about the possibility of using some sort of metrics. And metrics are really unpopular with a lot of people for very good reasons. They would make life a lot easier. And indeed, in I think it was the 2014 REF, there was a plan to actually use metrics rather than all this detailed assessment by panels. And basically academics rebelled and said, we're not having it, this is not right. And of course, they're quite right in the sense that metrics is reducing your fine body of work to a number that is on the one hand superficial, and probably not a very accurate representation of the quality of the work, will vary from discipline to discipline, and can also be gamed in various ways. So people are really not generally happy with metrics. The problem is that what people have come along with as an alternative is what they call peer review or expert review, which is much more acceptable to academics to have the idea that somebody will actually read your outputs and evaluate them and have some expert judgment. But the arguments that's been put forward, I think very cogently, particularly by Derek Sayer, in a book that he wrote a little while ago, around the time of the REF 2014, is that it's just not possible for these panels to be doing the kind of peer review that you would normally expect to have for grants and publications. There's just too much stuff for people to evaluate, and you can't have a panel that will cover all the relevant expertise. Derek Sayer himself is a historian of Bohemia and places, and says, you know, he submits a book on his history of Bohemia. There's nobody on the panel that knows anything about the history of Bohemia, so they may be able to tell whether he can write well and make a cogent argument, but they won't know whether what he's saying is accurate or complete in any sense. But they're going to give him a 4-star, 3-star, 2-star, whatever rating for it. So we have problems with the peer review. That's one disadvantage. And then you've got the business of arbitrariness. I've said, you know, yes, this is nice because it's transparent, but the problem is that it's one of these things that, although it's transparent, it can be tweaked, and the tweaking can have quite big effects. So this was really quite a gobsmacking thing, that we were all told before REF 2014 that the way that the funding would be allocated would be there would be some formula whereby every 4-star output from an institution was given 3 times as many points as a 3-star output, and that the 2-star and 1-star outputs would not be counted in the funding formula. So it was a sort of 3-to-1 ratio. After the results were in, it changed to a 4-to-1 ratio. One can ask why that might be. One consequence of that tends to be that the elite institutions at the top will get a bigger cut of the money. Now, I was recently reading this fine book by the economist John Kay called Obliquity, and I'll come back to John Kay because I found his thinking very congenial. And he had this very nice comment on, in a very different domain of life, on the United Nations Index of Human Development. And he said, this is an incredible thing. It's a formula that rank orders all the countries in the world according to how developed they are. And it has this formula that takes some very simple indicators: longevity, educational standards, and gross domestic product. And it somehow puts them all together by multiplying by various weightings and things and ending up with a number. And what do you have? You have Iceland at the top, you have Sierra Leone at the bottom. And he says, most people would agree that Iceland scores higher for human development than Sierra Leone. But if the index didn't give us that ranking, we would change the index, not our view of Iceland or Sierra Leone. I have a feeling that that's what happened in REF 2014. It didn't quite give the answer that people wanted, so the rankings were changed and the weightings were changed. That's a bit of a worry. And generally, any formula that doesn't put Oxford, London and Cambridge right at the top would just not be acceptable. But it's interesting, I did some simulations of data on this to sort of, I mean, it's an obvious point when you think about it, but if you assume this is a cumulative process, and the money you get for research on this round will allow you to develop your research and to retain good staff and to buy equipment so that on the next round you'll be even better, then you can see that you can end up with a cumulative process whereby the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And we have never really discussed this or thought about it, whether people say, well, you've got to reward excellence. But maybe, you know, this is not the appropriate way to go about things. And maybe we should be trying to encourage people that are not already at the top and give them resources so that they can actually do more and rise up, and we can have more top institutions. It's the sort of thing that's never discussed. It's just assumed that we need a formula that will somehow keep the status quo. The disadvantages that I have also been particularly keen to focus on, given my interest in what is this scientific replication crisis, is the impact on research culture, which I think has been really negative in terms of its effect on assuming that the only thing that matters about an academic is whether they are refable. In other words, you know, typically this is interpreted as meaning that they have to bring in grant income and they have to have a lot of papers in high-impact journals if you're a scientist, or presumably with you know, very reputable university presses. You have to have books if you're in humanities. And the problem with this is that it leads to people not necessarily doing things in a particularly careful or scholarly fashion because they feel the sense of pressure that they're not going to get a job unless they have these indicators that are going to make them able to be entered into the ref. And it's really creating an incentive structure that I think is quite corrosive and bad for scholarship. Here are some examples that I think I use to illustrate the point. I don't know how, this is a bit like, have I got news for you? There are 4 pictures, and you, instead of saying which one's the odd one out, what have they all got in common? Anybody know what these people have all got in common?
Nobel Prizes.
Nobel Prizes. They're all Nobel laureates. And another thing, though, that they've got in common, I'll give you their names, is that I would reckon these are all Nobel laureates who would not be refable. And indeed, Peter Higgs has said as much. He said, I would never have done the work that I've done, discovering the Higgs boson, under the current system, because the pressure would have been on him to continually be doing stuff and publishing stuff. He needed to think long and hard. There's people like John Sulston who said very much the same thing in the field of genetics. Donna Strickland was the woman who got the Physics Nobel Prize this year, and some people have been saying, but she's only got an H-index of 19. As if that's, means that she couldn't possibly be worthy of a Nobel Prize. Doesn't matter what her H-index is. If she's done some really good work that's worthy of a Nobel Prize. Einstein, of course, was a classic example of somebody who wouldn't have been bringing in the big grants, one guesses. And the last one of these, Daniel Kahneman, is a psychologist, so I know more about him. And he's an interesting psychologist who won his Nobel Prize in economics because he was very good at talking about, demonstrating how people are not logical in how they make their decisions. So the views of economics had somehow treated people as rational beings, and he pointed out that there are many influences on how we reason that are not in line with economic rationality. So the work he did, it was well regarded, but the point about it was it didn't bring in big grants. It was easy stuff to do. You needed a few people with pens and paper. You didn't need brain scanners and things. So you didn't have vast squads of people employed, and he would be regarded as underperforming in many departments today if he came along with no grants, which would have been his situation. So this is really worrying if we get into a situation where we're treating the amount of funding that you need to do research as a proxy for the value of the research. Because some activities are intrinsically more expensive, and it just doesn't make sense to disfavour the areas that cost less. And most, I would say, not just many, but most great discoveries involve very slow, careful work over a period of years. And even though I know that the people devising the REF have tried quite hard to avoid people thinking, oh, well, I've just got to produce lots and lots of papers, or I've just got to produce papers in Nature and Science or whatever. Nevertheless, there's clearly this perception that you have to be producing early and quickly, or you're going to not be employable. And this is really quite a serious downside, and this is why I said I don't really believe that the REF has improved research in this country. There's another unintended consequence of all of this, which is that, again, I don't know if this is true in the humanities, but in the sciences, because you are well regarded in proportion to the amount of grant income that you have, people tend to get far more grants than they can possibly actually look after and think about and do the work on with any degree of commitment. And so there's a lot of studies that are not very well done, and people end up with huge backlogs of stuff that is never written up, because once you've run your studies and done your work on one grant, you don't have time to sit and think about it for a few years, because you have to put in another one, because if you haven't got a grant, you might not be employable. And so there's this huge amount of waste, which I refer to as the academic backlog. And it gets worse the older you get. And you can sit and say to any audience, if you were to do nothing, if you were to have no more research income for the next 5 years, would you clear your academic backlog? And if people of my generation would say, no, it would take me 10 years. I've got tons of stuff that's never written up, and I feel terribly guilty about it. So we are wasting our resources by this focus on this relentless productivity. So I think there's a time for a rethink. And I think one of the things we need to rethink is what are we trying to do with the REF? And I think a big problem is that it's required a major role as a status indicator. And the universities are competing to be at the top of various league tables, including, I mean, this is from the Times Higher, the league table for comparing who's at the top rank in 2008 and 2014 and how the movements have occurred. And people will obsess about these and get terribly worried if they're not in quite the same position they were in last year. And this is based on the mean star rating of all these outputs per staff member entered, in order to ensure that you're not just going to favour large institutions. But it's a pure status indicator. That's the only function it serves. And in fact, it is the case that this is the size of the institution, the number of full-time equivalent staff that are entered. They tend to anyway be near the top. But then you can see that lower down you can have quite a mixture of these Greek GPA scores amongst institutions that are rather smaller, and so everybody's jostling down there to try and be above everybody else. I would argue we could just get rid of that. I mean, it's not clear to me that that is serving a useful purpose, because you're just comparing people for these number of star ratings. All the institutions down there, they're all sort of having in their mission statements that they're going to be world leading. I mean, how many universities can be leading the world, for heaven's sake? You know, it's ridiculous. I mean, what we should be doing is finding our own niches and getting a diverse sector that, you know, where you can get a university that's good at some things and not at others, instead of this notion that we've all got to be world leading at everything. The original goal, the reason I gave you all that history was to remind us all that the original goal of REF was nothing to do with league tables. It was everything to do with just having a problem of how do you distribute a limited amount of money transparently. And it's still used for that. So you can also, from the REF, get out this so-called power score, and that will be based on the number of staff entered into the REF, and then this is weighted by the number of 4-star and 3-star rankings of outputs. And as I've said, it used to be that the ratio between 4 and 3 was 3 to 1, it's now gone up to 4 to 1. And there's talk of it going up even higher in 2021. You then need to take into account that some disciplines are just more expensive than others, so medicine is expensive to run, more so than humanities, for instance, and there's a formula for that. But at the end of the day, you can get out something called a power score, which is strongly related to the size of the institution, and which is quite sensibly then used to divide up the money, in the sense that if you've got a lot of researchers, you're going to need more money than if you've only got few. What's interesting is that this indicator, even though it includes all this messing about with 4 stars and 3 stars, its relationship to the size of the institution is nearly linear and nearly perfect. So that correlation is 0.998. Now, given these huge differences here and here, this doesn't mean that if you substituted this for this quality score that there would be no consequences, and that this could make a difference in income here. I'll show you who these institutions are. You've got UCL, which is really big, and then you've got Oxford and Cambridge, Edinburgh. So you've got these big ones up here, and their income might rise or fall if you were to just make your distribution in terms of the size of the institution, in terms of a number of full-time equivalent staff. But on the other hand, it would cost them so much less if you did the formula this way, instead of making everybody go through this quality exercise. It would actually perhaps be worth the savings. So I would suggest that if we return to this original goal of seeing the REF as a way of distributing funds transparently, we could actually get rid of all this quality review and obtain similar funding outcomes by and this is done at the institutional level. So this works best if you have a really big unit that you're evaluating it by. But of course, the other advantage of that is that you're not invidiously picking out people and saying you're refable, you're not refable. You're just saying the institution has got this number of researchers, give us this much money, thank you very much. It would be doable, it would be gameable, and it would certainly require also some rules to stop it getting gamed too much. But I think we would lose rather little. James Wilsden, who has written a lot about metrics and the ref, has written quite sensibly on this topic and said that he actually agrees with me. I was quite amused to see that he actually does say, if that's all we wanted to do, we could use very simple metrics, even down to the number of people entered in the ref. But he's concerned that then we would lose something, because he thinks we should be using the ref to do all these other things, that it's gradually accreted a number of different functions. So he thinks we should use it to nudge change, as he said, throughout the system, maybe in requirements on open access, not a terribly popular topic with some, or on the use of unique identifiers like ORCID numbers. And given the reach of the ref into all corners of university research, it's arguably the most efficient and effective way of introducing changes of this kind. But actually, these are things that don't, again, require all this quality rating. I mean, the great thing that people are terrified of is that if you don't start trying to rate research quality, we'll all stop trying. I think that's a misunderstanding of how academics function. Anyway, that's the ref, my thoughts on the ref, and I'll come back and say a little bit more about putting the ref and the TEF together, but let me move on to the TEF. So as you'll gather, I'm not a fan of the ref, but I really am not a fan of the TEF. I think the teaching excellence framework is a zillion times worse than the research excellence framework. It's a much younger thing. It was introduced, first of all, we heard about it in a green paper that was circulated by the then Minister, Joe Johnson, as part of the Higher Education and Research Bill. The TEF was going to be introduced because he said there'd been a manifesto promise that we would have this, and we were going to have it. And this green paper wasn't saying, should we have it? It was saying, we're going to have it, and asking whether we agreed how it should be done. Why should we do it? Well, a justification, he said, was that teaching in universities was being neglected in relation to research. Weak incentives on higher education providers to increase the standard of teaching. Many universities see their reputation, their standing in prestigious international league tables, and their marginal funding as being principally determined by scholarly output. Teaching has regrettably been allowed to become a poor cousin. Now, I think he's right. I think there's evidence that has happened in a lot of places, but why has it happened? It's happened because of the ref and the way the ref is operating. So there's two answers to that if you think that that's the case. One is to get rid of the ref, and then you'll remove this imbalance in the incentives. But the other that Johnson prefers is that let's have a league table for teaching, so that we can now not just be evaluated on our research, but also on our teaching. So the idea is more league tables, but this time for the teaching side of things, and then we'll somehow get swinging back on the pendulum. Now, what I find really difficult about this is that when you look at the case that he tried to make for introducing the TEF, it's a sort of thing that if an undergraduate came up with it in an essay, you would give them a sort of very low mark. It's a clear case of not so much evidence-based policy, but policy-based evidence, picking your evidence because you're going to do this, and then you look around for evidence. And I'll justify that rather severe claim by showing you some examples. And this is just a subset of the examples because I don't want to go on too late. First of all, he said, he basically said, our teaching in our universities is patchy and lamentable. And the evidence for this started in a speech of his with an anecdote that he talked to worried parents. So he talked to a physics teacher whose son dropped out at the start of year 2 of a humanities programme at a prestigious London university, having barely set eyes on his tutor, whereas the other son was studying engineering at Bristol, saw the system at its best, worked off his feet, plenty of support. And on the basis of this anecdote, we hear that this is evidence of patchiness in the student experience within and between institutions which cannot continue, and so on, and there's lamentable teaching that must be driven out of our system. So this sounds pretty bad. He was challenged, though, at a government select committee to give the evidence for it beyond his anecdote. Where is this evidence that the teaching is so lamentable? And he came back referring to the National Student Survey. And he said quite a lot about it, but the main thing he said to justify this lamentable idea is that there were 2/3 of providers in the National Student Survey which were performing well below their peers on at least one aspect of the student experience. This is a bit like Lake Wobegon, where all the children are above average, only this is universities where they're all below average. Anyway, so I sort of thought, let's look at the NSS data. This is the distribution, so this is in institutions rank ordered here, depending on how good their NSS responses are to just one question. Item 22, overall I am satisfied with the quality of the course, and this is the proportion of responses. So basically, if you've got blues and particularly if you've got purples, people are pretty happy overall. Does this look like a crisis of lamentable teaching? Even if you accept that this is a measure of teaching? No, of course it doesn't. There's a few places down here that one might want to worry about, where there are some people who are not too happy. But most of this, I mean, if you were running a hotel or something and this was the feedback you got, you'd think you're doing pretty well. And the only way you can get the picture that he is trying to portray of major problems is because he does a sort of statistical trick of saying, if anybody who's below average, and if the average is incredibly high, you can be below average and still be doing pretty well. But anybody who's below average on at least one indicator out of 21 indicators is going to be regarded as having problems. And I can give a whole talk on this if you like, but I won't because of the time. But I've sort of documented the problems with this argument. And it's really a very, very shifty argument indeed. But further evidence that students are dissatisfied. Again, he was quoted a source here. He said that students are concerned about value for money. A third of undergraduates are paying higher fees in England, believing their course represents very poor or poor value for money. And he cited a report by the Higher Education Policy Institute, the 2015 Student Academic Experience Survey. And indeed, he was right in the figures that he gave, which is found here, that if you are here in these blue or this red area, you think you've received poor value for money. Now, the point is that is correct, but there's two sides to the equation for value for money. There's value and there's money. And when one's talking about value for money, it's not just whether you think what you're getting is good, but it's whether somebody else is getting the same thing and paying a lot less. And here we have the obvious comparison with Scotland, where they're not paying enormous fees and where they're much more cheerful. And this was a point that was made in the HEPI report. They said that the perceptions of value for money have diverged as a result of the increase in the fees to £9,000 for 2012 for students from England. In Scotland, they're all much happier. But if you ask them a different question, if you just say to them, do you think your course is good? To what extent are you satisfied or not with the overall quality of your course? These are the same students who don't think it's very good value for money, but they think the quality is okay. So the obvious conclusion is they think they're paying too much for it compared to everybody else because other people are getting the same thing for a lot less, but they don't think it's a bad course in itself. So again, the solution is not to sort of come down and say we're all teaching them terribly. It might be to do something about the fee structure. This isn't to say there's no problems, and then, surveys like the HEPI survey are important for throwing up areas of dissatisfaction and difficulty. I wouldn't want to deny that there's any problems at all, but they're being really misrepresented by the way they were covered in the green paper and in a lot of what Johnson was writing. One of the problems is that the students are not terribly happy with the information they were getting before starting their course. And again, this was something that has been much spoken about in terms of why we need a TEF. It's because students don't have enough information, and somehow giving them a TEF is going to give them information. The trouble is you don't need a TEF. What you need is a place where they can get the information. There's now something called Unistat. Unistat is like a sort of trip advisor for universities. You can go and you can pull out various courses and you can compare them. And a lot of my colleagues in CWU are very sniffy about Unistat because they say, well, it's just going to encourage people to do things like look at how much you can earn and so on. I don't think that actually matters. It just gives them information about the National Student Survey. It gives them information about dropouts and so on. And I think it's useful information. I just pulled out at random 4 law degrees that you can take, and there you can see they're at the beginning of the alphabet, and 5 of them, and I thought let's compare them. And what you can see is if you were a student thinking of doing a law degree and thinking you might want to be a solicitor or whatever, that you might not want to go to Croydon College where 40% of them drop out. Important information for students to have, I think. In general, these sorts of figures I had to look to find somebody that was that poor. But in general, these are things that students might find useful, and with appropriate contextualization, these sort of statistics are useful. But you don't need a TEF for it. You just need to put the information out there and make it available. The metrics that they do plan to use for the TEF, they have changed since this was the original idea, and they've changed a bit, but it's basically broadly the same thing, that they're trying to use the National Student Survey questions, some information about non-continuation rates from the Individualised Learner Record, and then things about employment or further study later on, which is from a survey of destinations of leavers. And again, it's one of these formulae where you're going to put this all together in some sort of formula with different weightings for different things. You're going to interpret it in the light of qualitative information to give it context, which means you can be extremely subjective in what you actually do end up doing. And then you're going to reduce it to a 3-point scale so that they're all awarded either gold, silver or bronze. I mean, why? Why is one doing this? It does seem to be a sort of incredible reduction of something very complex to something oversimplistic and not very useful. There have been a lot of criticisms of the validity of the TEF metrics. The National Student Survey Scales ask all sorts of questions of students about whether the staff explain things and whether they give you feedback and whether they support you. But it's been pointed out that these are not questions these are not evaluating teaching quality. They're also benchmarked in a way that I won't talk about now, but if people want to talk to me about benchmarking, I regard it as a fairly pernicious thing in this context, because it seems to imply that if, for example, you're from a minority ethnic group, we might say we're not going to be so worried if you're unhappy with your course, because that's normal for people like you. So the problem with the NSS is that it doesn't measure teaching quality. The Royal Statistical Society were absolutely magnificent in their response to the Green Paper, and had lovely gems like this. So these are all online, the responses. You know, do you agree with the criteria? No. Outline your reasons and suggest alternatives. It is concerning, say the Royal Statistical Society, that figure 4 equates student satisfaction as measured by the National Student Survey with teaching quality. We are not aware that there is any evidence of a statistical association between the two concepts. What some research does show is that there's no reliable association between the two. Anecdotally, they add, we've heard of institutions explicitly dumbing down programs to get higher NSS scores. The students are happy because it's all so easy. And that this is something that they point out may inadvertently encourage us not to provide highly educated people of use to society, but just the opposite. So they were really good. The other point that they made is aligned to the one I was making with my beautifully coloured plot of these NSS results. This is the same plot that they did with the Office of National Statistics, but turned it on its side, but with an important addition here, which is that this is question 22, what proportion of people are satisfied. These are the higher education institutes ordered by rank, and as you can again see, most of them the satisfaction is pretty high. But what they've added are these things which are error bars, which, for those of you who are not into maths and statistics, is just an indication of how much confidence you can place in that estimate, which will be smaller, less confidence if it's a small institution. So you're basing it on just a few students' responses. If you've got a huge number, you can be more confident that it's an accurate estimate. So you've got something known as error of measurement. And what the point that the ONS made is that if you look at these error bars, even if somebody's got perhaps 0.84 and somebody else has got 0.8, it's not a meaningful difference because the error bars are very much overlapping, because there's just always going to be some slop in the system. This is going to be a really big problem if, as is proposed, we then go on to subject level TEF, because that means you're going to be basing these estimates on far, far smaller units of data. And that's a problem that somehow one doesn't feel that they've not understood it, or they're deliberately not understanding it. Even the chair of the TEF panel, Chris Husbands, has noted some problems with the use of the National Student Survey. This is a different problem. Student satisfaction seems to be driven by the physical attractiveness of academics rather than anything else. Oh my God, I mean, so it's even discriminatory. But he didn't sort of say we won't use it at all. He just said, they've played it down a bit. We won't draw policy from a single data point. All data are flawed in some respect, but the challenge was to recognise and understand the flaws. perhaps it would be to get rid of the TEF. Because at the moment what we've got is a set of incommensurate and invalid metrics which we're then going to combine to give you a 3-point scale which really has potential to damage the reputation of institutions who end up with a bronze, which is then seen as terribly bad, when it's based on all these underlying metrics that are really not very sensible. Now, as I did with the REF, I was thinking, well, if we've got all these costs of the TEF, are there any benefits? And that's really the question. Can you weigh up one against the other? And I was astounded to find that the Department for Business, etc., had actually done a cost-benefit analysis, and it was really a remarkable thing. I had difficulty understanding it for a while because they kept talking about businesses, but what they actually meant were universities. But they said that the Teaching Excellence Framework, the direct cost to business, the whole sector, was 20 million. It's going to cost us 20 million to run the TEF, which is about, they said, 53,000 per institution, ho-ho. But the benefit to businesses was going to be so much greater. I mean, it was going to be £1,146 million benefit. So I thought, blimey, something here is very strange. What's going on? Well, what is going on is that this benefit accrues to you because if you get a silver or gold, you can put your fees up. If you don't enter the TEF, you can't put your fees up. And this is assuming some inflation, and so your actual value of fees will go down. If you get a bronze, it will go down a bit, but not as badly. But if you get a silver or gold, you'll be able to keep your fees up in line with inflation. And that is the benefit of the TEF. I mean, really. I mean, you really could argue this is not sensible. What isn't taken into account with any of these things are the costs to academic staff. We've already got the REF, which requires us to bring in substantial income, publish in high-impact journals, manage a research group, just demonstrate impact. And now we have the TEF, which, if you look at the National Student Survey, if you want to get a good TEF rating, you have to be available for students, provide detailed and prompt feedback, give interesting lectures with enthusiasm, and ensure that they all go on to get good jobs. And meanwhile, you're supposed to also be a good academic citizen and be on committees and do your Athena Swan and all sorts of things. I mean, this is really problematic, the degree to which we're expecting people to continually be evaluated in all these different domains and not crumble under the pressure. Sally Hunt suggested a while ago that rather than having the TEF, the student experience might be improved by not having them taught so much by people who are in casualised labour, who were often on short-term contracts, may not be able to get to know the students, were highly stressed themselves, etc., etc. And I can only agree with that. I think that this is the one side of the equation which is never looked at, which is the staff side. So, well, let me just try and pull it together. You'll see that I've been getting at both of these things, the REF and the TEF. But I'd like to put it together by returning to this book by John Kay, this Obliquity book, because I feel that he said a lot of things that have a lot of relevance for the academic sector, although he was focusing more on business and what makes a business successful. But he draws in a lot of examples from other spheres of life, including at times academia. And he has this nice little story, which is, apparently this is an old story, I hadn't heard of it before though. You've got a medieval cathedral and you've got 3 stonemasons, and you go up and you say to them, what are you doing? And the first one says, I'm cutting this piece of stone. And the other one says, I'm building a cathedral. And then the other one says, I'm working for the glory of God. And Kay says, well, you know, this is a nice distinction between, these are all things, different levels at which you can describe what you're doing. You have basic actions, there's intermediate goals, and then there's these high-level objectives. And his argument is that when you're making decisions, what people have started to do all the time is to try and reduce the high-level objectives to their intermediate goals and basic actions and track them back and then get things that they can quantify and quantify them and combine them and then say, oh, we're achieving our higher level goal. And he says that this is a terrible, terrible mistake, and that it's much more important to focus on the high level goal and accept that all these different things are going to be involved in achieving it without trying to somehow reduce them to it. And he says no priest or politician, counsellor or manager has the capacity to do this. And those that claim to have an immense capacity to damage the complex systems they attempt to plan. I think this is absolutely true for universities. In that imperfectly understood world, high-level objectives are best achieved by constantly balancing they're incompatible and incommensurable components through what he calls obliquity. Approach things more obliquely. Do not try to reduce them and tackle them head on. So that's my way of trying to think about things, and I would say my particular recommendations for doing that would be to get rid of a lot of the attempts to measure things and evaluate things from simple metrics. So ditch the league tables, foster diversity of institutions, stop trying to design perfect and comprehensive evaluation systems, and I think we academics are to blame for a lot of that because we don't like metrics for good reasons, but we then move on and say, oh, you know, well, we must tweak it, and we end up with these Byzantine complexity systems that are just really unmanageable. We should just rethink and simplify the REF rather than trying to perfect it. Get rid of the quality evaluation, which wastes the time and generates bad incentives. And if you had block funding at the level of the institution, at this really large mega level, and then let the institution do what it wanted with the money, it would get rid of a lot of the stress and the strife. The TEF, I think we can just get rid of. It's a solution to a non-problem. You need to have a system that can deal with the rare cases of real failure where students are very, very unhappy. But we've already had that in the Quality Assurance Agency. And Unistat can provide students with information. You don't need more than that. But the main message is, do we need to just give our academics time and security to do the job well and stop trying to create incentive structures which are superfluous, because most of us are strongly incentivized to do good work, and we don't need people dangling things in front of us and telling us that this is what we need to do to be a good academic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. I think you've done something rather remarkable, actually, because you've given us both breadth and depth, and you've been both humorous and serious at the same time. And I think, above all, you've given us a great deal to think about. Now, we have about half an hour for questions. Before we open up, just 2 points. First of all, there is a register, or perhaps I should say an attendance list, going around somewhere. Have you all signed in? It would be very helpful for us to know who's come along. And the second question, the second issue is that as has been already mentioned by Anne, this talk is being recorded. So bear that in mind when you're asking your questions. We do not have a roving mic, unfortunately. So possibly the best way around that is to speak as clearly as you can. The acoustics in this hall are quite good, but maybe, Dorothy, if you could just repeat very briefly the question when it's been given, and that'll make sure it's been properly recorded.
Okay.
Thank you. So, who would like to start?
Your recommendation is to ditch league tables, your first recommendation. But league tables are run by journals, newspapers and institutions over which there isn't and shouldn't be any control. So how do you propose to do that?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think, do we have somebody here from the Times Higher? Yes. And of course the Times Higher, which I love in many, many ways, at the same time is regarded by many people as the big bad wolf in terms of its fascination and continual promotion of all sorts of different league tables. I don't know is the answer. I mean, I think as long as there's an appetite for them, people will still use them. But I think if our vice-chancellors just pointed out that they didn't matter, and if they were not sort of taken seriously by academics, then they just wouldn't have so much impact. But I don't have a good answer for that. And sorry, I forgot to repeat your question. So I've already, with question number 1, failed to do what I'm supposed to do.
I have an answer to this question. To educate people.
This is what we do as academics, right? But we're not asked to do it.
If we educate people and we explain, as Dorothy did for us this evening, I think that we will make them think, and they will react through books, through various responses. And I think that one of the great powers of television and of various debates is, as in other cases of political debates and so forth that we know that are happening around, this freedom of speech. So if we invite scholars like Dorothy that have a deep understanding of the matter and we educate the public through the press, the time allocation, and also television programs, then I think that we stand a good chance of transforming this illusion that we can measure everything.
You mentioned the league tables and also impact factors. We are all encouraged to publish in high impact factor journals. And everybody says that, from the very low to the very highest strategic objective. Does anybody know really how those impact factors, how those numbers are arrived at?
Oh,
what
right.
do they represent?
Okay.
Who has done them?
Yep,
How?
I do. I know about impact factors. So the question was, you know, we're all encouraged to publish in high impact journals. How are these impact factors arrived at? I should start by saying that this is not the fault of the REF. That HEFCE had very clear instructions that the panel should not use journal impact factors in making their recommendations, because it is recognised that journal impact factors are not a sensible way of judging the quality of pieces of research. It's a metric that was designed by somebody as a tool for librarians. The idea was that you took all the articles published in a journal, and you looked at the distribution of citations. I mean, I'm sorry, for those of you in humanities, this is probably all gobbledygook, but you would look at how often the articles had been cited, and then you plot this, and there's a sort of distribution of citation counts, and a high impact journal is one where that distribution has got quite a high median. The interesting thing is it's typically got a very long tail, so the impact factor is often determined by a relatively small percentage of papers published in the journal that have had a very big impact. And if you take journals like Science and Nature, you know, they will publish the paper which discovers DNA or whatever. And so they get a very high impact factor. And then everybody else wants to publish in those journals because it's a high impact factor, and that's become the currency. But the guy who invented the impact factor has complained that it was never intended to be used to rate individual papers, because you're rating a paper by the company it keeps rather than by its own intrinsic worth. You're saying because it's in that journal it has to be good. The other thing that is correlated with impact factor is retraction rate. Journals with high impact factors tend to have more papers retracted. They take risks with things that sound incredibly sexy. So they're not necessarily the best pieces of work, but this is appreciated by the people who do the REF. It's just unfortunately such an easy currency that it does tend to be used by a lot of people. But I don't use it, and there are many people in science who are really fighting a rearguard action against the idea of using impact factors, because the Wellcome Trust, God bless them, who fund me, say that you should not be using them in evaluating people when they come up for grants and so on. So there is a recognition that it's not a sensible scale, but it's perhaps a rather rarefied group of people that have it. Yeah.
On that point, I've read a couple of papers that say that the ratings of papers for the last REF actually correlated very closely with the impact factors of the journals in which those papers were published.
Oh, I didn't know that, yes.
Well, I don't know how much of a consensus there is. But you know, I found that a bit unnerving, because I'm always assured by, you know, the wise souls who advise me about the REF that in fact it's nothing to do with the journal.
Yes. So do you just want me to sort of respond to? Yeah. So the question or comment really was that there's the star ratings in the REF do correlate with the impact factor of the journals that they appear in, and that's information that I had not been aware of. But of course, if that is the case, it could mean one of two things. It could mean that the best paper appears in the high impact journals, or it could be that the panel are very heavily swayed by impact factors, even though they've been told not to be swayed by impact factors. But I think, I mean, in my own discipline, the best quality work, and maybe this is just different for psychology, but in psychology you don't get a lot of publications in the really sort of nature, science, cell sort of journals which have got these astronomically high impact factors. We get some papers out in something called Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, and in my experience they're uniformly bad, or perhaps not uniformly, but they tend to be sort of flash in the pan. Here's an incredibly sexy, exciting result. And the best papers in psychology, I would say, are those that tend to be published in the middle-ranking society journals, because they know the reviewers. The thing about these very high impact factor journals is that they don't have specialist reviewers. They tend to have people who are reviewing the papers who don't know who to ask the editors don't know who to ask as referees. Whereas if you send a paper to the Journal of Experimental Psychology or something, which has got a lower impact factor, you will have typically very good editing and very good reviewing from people who know what's what. So my own view is that those tend to be the pieces of work that have more substance and that tend to last. And I think that's true in quite a lot of disciplines. But I think the whole publishing system is being shaken up by so many different forces at the moment that I don't think that impact factors are necessarily even going to last, because we've got the whole open access movement coming in as well, which is really messing with this hierarchy in a way that is hard to anticipate how it's all going to pan out.
Colleague with the orange.
Yeah, so I wanted to follow up on part of the question about correlation between impact factors and ref scores, but also ask a question. So the follow-up is to say that if you consult Appendix B of the metric times, which is a report written by Dorothy, you'll find some measures of the correlation between the particle impact factors and the ref scores. In my discipline, which is political science, the correlation is quite low, 2.3 and 0.4, and generally what you would want if you're looking for a high-stakes decision-making process to use. The question that was about... Can I just ask, Appendix B of what?
The metric tide. So James Wilston has done a big analysis of whether or not metrics should be used in the ref, and it's available. I think you can just download it online. It's called the metric tide.
So the question though was about the tech.
Yes.
And the benchmarks and the splits, because I actually find them quite helpful, and I would certainly find them helpful if there was poor old Croydon College judged on a non-continuation rate, which I would imagine is down much more to the types of students that they attract rather than anything intrinsic to them. So you said that you would go on to talk about that if anyone else. Yes. No, that are you Chris Hanratty? Ah, good to meet you at last. Only known you over Twitter. For non-continuation rates, I mean, the problem is that what makes me really uneasy about benchmarks is that for some things, I think they are reasonable, and maybe non-continuation rates more so, but certainly student satisfaction. I would be really worried about that being benchmarked, because I would have thought if you have got an intake of students who are maybe not of a traditional kind and who don't necessarily flourish under a conventional system, that what you would want to do is to make sure that they were nevertheless satisfied with what you had to offer them, not just say, oh, well, of course, that they're from an ethnic minority, they're not going to be satisfied, because, that's what we know. So I think benchmarking is a bit insidious, and you have to look quite carefully at what it is you're trying to do with it. And when you say poor old Croydon College, I'm sorry, but I still think a 40% dropout rate is not acceptable. I mean, they should be teaching those people in a way that they can continue, surely, if they're offering a course. And certainly I think a lot of people applying for courses do have there's a lot of people who have no idea of the differences between different places. And, maybe there's somebody here from Croydon College who wants to defend it, but... yeah.
I have a rather general question, stepping back. You demonstrated really clearly that these decisions of the systems are put in place by politicians that want to distribute a shrinking budget based on some measures. And you also clearly demonstrated that many of their assumptions have been challenged early on. And we know that metrics are really challenging and damaging for universities. What I do not understand is, when this is known, why has University UK not challenged politicians and hold them to account with the proper arguments, but just taking on all these regulations without twitching with an eye? I don't understand this at all.
Yeah, so I think probably that was audible, but the question is, why hasn't Universities UK agreed with these criticisms and challenged the assumptions behind a lot of what's been going on with Ref and TEF? I can only agree that I find it rather puzzling And I think there has been a shift in the nature of who are our, people who have been appointed to jobs as vice-chancellors over the years, and that they do tend to be very much people with a view to treating, I mean, this whole idea of universities being treated like businesses, and these are sometimes people from a business background who really, there's this notion that we need to be incentivized that worries me. I mean, I think this is one of the things that defines an academic or a good academic, is that, you don't need to, you're not going to sort of suddenly start deciding that you're not going to do good work anymore because somebody's not incentivizing you. Whereas it might be true in business that you feel you have to offer those incentives. Though even in business, I mean, I think the businesses that are most successful, there's a nice example again in that John Kay book of, they tend to be the ones with happy staff who feel valued and looked after and allowed to get on with doing what they want to do. The problem with that argument, of course, is that from the point of view of the politicians, it looks as if we're just saying, don't regulate us, you can't regulate us, leave us alone, we want to just sit in our ivory towers and do whatever we want to do. And it's very hard to justify, I think we have to be very sensitive to the way in which academics are viewed by politicians and by many members of the general public who really don't understand what our day-to-day jobs do look like, and who just see us, apparently swanning around, not having all the hassles of life that they have. And they tend to think that we need to be sort of held to account in some way. And I think that perhaps we need to have more open door policies and so that people can see exactly what it is we're doing. We do need perhaps to have more outreach work, because I think that is at the heart of the problem. But Universities UK, I mean, I think the CWU has always been very disappointed in vice-chancellors in particular, and how few of them have shown any backbone against, particularly the TEF. The REF had been around for a long time and did start with a reasonable rationale, but the TEF, there was more critical comment on that green paper, I have to say, than typically you get with a green paper. And the University of Cambridge had a very good, strong critique of it in their response, and some other universities came out quite strong against it, to a degree that was quite surprising. But on the whole, you get the impression, I think, maybe universities are running scared ever since Thatcher. There's, Thatcher showed that if you upset a prime minister, they have the purse strings.
I
have a question regarding the modification of the REF. So, first of all, I have to say the numbers that show are astonishing. We didn't realize the ratio of people on the panel and how many publications we need to look at. So it's quite clear that we cannot really do any qualitative evaluation, or qualitative, evaluation of the different publications. And of course, metrics are also not good, but I was surprised by your suggestion of how to look at it. And I have to say that initially when you showed the correlation between number of people at the institute and the ranking, my first thing was not that this shows that they really correlate that well, but this shows that the more people you have at the institute, the easier it is for you to gamify it, the entire submission. And therefore, I wouldn't necessarily see this correlation as showing that really number of people is what shows quality. And I'm wondering, there are, people also talk about it in terms of grants. Do you want to maybe not do necessarily the selection, but are there other ways to distribute your money? Maybe something to make sure that everyone gets, not everyone gets the same, but everyone gets something, and not just basically other ways of thinking how to distribute your funds.
Yeah, so I think there's two questions in there, and one is this business of, well, if we just went down to the size of the institution and awarded funding on the basis of that, couldn't it be gamified and people would just appoint loads of people? You have to bear in mind, though, that, this is where I say it would need some tweaking to avoid that, and I think one way you could do it would be by saying you can only count people who've been at the institution for 3 years.
I think that what I'm saying is not so much that people would be able to gamify, but the fact that right now there's a correlation doesn't actually mean that institutes with more people are better. It just means they're better able to submit stronger submissions because they can play more with what is.
No, but I think it's not that they're actually submitting stronger submissions. It's just that the quality rankings are really rather minor in relation to the big impact of the number of people that are there. So that's the big driving force, and it's just. I don't think it's that. On the other hand, one can say that it's going to be the case that, suppose, Croydon College decided it wanted to get a high REF score. What's it going to do? Is it going to suddenly appoint 100 researchers out of nowhere? Of course not. I mean, in order to be able to build up a research base like that, you have to already have something going for you to be able to attract people there, but you also have a lot of costs to put out to run a large university with a lot of researchers in it. So I think there is a sense in which size it's not something that you can just suddenly buy in a lot of people and assume that then you're going to be wonderful. You do have to take into consideration that it would be a strategic move on the part of the university to appoint extra people, which would cost them money, and they would need to be thinking quite hard about whether any money recouped would be justified. But the second question about, is it appropriate to just think in terms of awarding money along those lines, and should we not be attempting to build up perhaps some smaller places and give them a stronger research capacity? I agree with that. I mean, I think but that question has never, as far as I know, ever been asked. It's always just been assumed that unless you give most money to people who've got, on whatever metric you want to use, already got the greatest research strength, that you're going to be rewarding failure. I mean, this is not really, this is getting at quite deep issues about what sort of higher education sector we want. And it does seem that at the moment we're working in a way where what we want is a sector which has most of the research strength concentrated in a few elite institutions. And it could be argued that maybe that's the most effective way of doing things, but it worries me, because I think it's definitely the case that the Golden Triangle does absorb most of the funding and has most of the people in it, and who are doing this sort of so-called 4-star research. And I would like to see a much more egalitarian structure. So I don't know what the answer is entirely, but I just wish we would had a chance to discuss these issues a bit more, rather than just pushing on with the system, which is certainly, in the way it's set up at the moment, it's just increasing the divide between the haves and the have-nots.
I had Justin first.
Thank you, and I apologise, I've got to go. But I wonder if we could play a counterfactual game. If we had a league table that put Oxford and Cambridge and London at the bottom and Croydon at the top, would suddenly all of those bright young things from Eton, like the Johnsons, decide to go to Croydon? I don't think so. I mean, I think I very much appreciate your analysis, but there's a dimension of class that we're not capable of engaging with because we're not allowed to talk about it. But I really do think we talk about allocation of resource. It should be investment. Mm-hmm. They're using the business language. Mm. And Alistair McIntyre, a few years ago, wrote about what's the difference between Scotland and England. Well, in Scotland, the university tradition has been about investing in public good, creating a citizen body who are independent, articulate, and capable of criticising the state, is what the Scottish project is about, and has been for 100 years. Whereas ours is to train up business managers, as far as I can see. So, is the answer actually away from individuals like the Johnsons the right to determine how we invest money in collections of people whose aim is to educate and to create the public good? Why is there no factor for calculating public good?
I know. Well, I could only agree that, when I read the Green Paper and the CDBU, we put in a response to it, that a number of us got together and talked it through and thought about it, and it was really hard, because I've always taken the view that if you want to interact and be effective with government, you mustn't come across as somebody who's just having a knee-jerk reaction about anything that they do. You've got to try and see it, where they're coming from, and understand their perspective, and then you'll be more effective in arguing against them. And within about 5 minutes, I was just tearing my hair out. I mean, it was just sort of like they had no understanding of what universities were about in this document. And it was really this notion of this public good. I mean, it was all about, the students are paying money and they've got to therefore have, good paying jobs at the end of it. And it was, I don't know, it was very, very hard to engage with it at anything other than a very cynical level, because there was just such a mismatch between how they were portraying universities and what went on in them. what actually most of us who have sort of higher ideals would like to have going on in them. But I do think that, you know, it's easy to sort of tear one's hair out and fulminate and so on, but we have to try and think of positive. This is why, even though I'm being controversial, I'm trying to end with some recommendations rather than just telling you it's all terrible. I mean, my recommendations would be very radical and would involve overthrowing what's there, but I think, you know, I sort of throw it out because people can then at least push back against it, and we may end up with some suggestions that we could put to perhaps a different government that would take a different view if it comes in, but yeah.
We have a colleague at the back.
Yeah, so my question follows nicely on from your recommendations. I had a question about really to what extent you think your recommendations and more generally the push against evaluations and regulation of academics is kind of facing an uphill battle with particularly social sciences and some medical sciences, with now the open science replication problems that are coming out and gaining public traction. And my feeling and sense of reading the public debates about this is that people now are starting to think, you know, are they doing a lot of crap work? Like, why should we back off with the regulation and the evaluation? Like, should we increase the evaluation if academics are getting away with this sort of poor quality research, which, you know, is driven maybe by incentives, maybe by other things? It's kind of happening in an inopportune time, these recommendations, because I don't think there's much flavour for it in the public sphere. At least that's my impression of the way the replication stuff is going right now.
So you're saying, if I've understood you correctly, that because we have things like the replication crisis, when the public are going to think we need even more regulation because we can't be trusted. Yeah, I mean, I'm more encouraged about the problems with replication, actually. I mean, I'm very involved in that line of work, and what is striking about it is that the next generation, the early career researchers, are really moving ahead quite rapidly and trying to change things and institute, you know, improvements in the system. And I think we will overcome that one because, perhaps one reason why we will is that it's not just the scientists themselves that are trying to do things, but the funders are now getting very exercised about this notion of waste and the idea that if they're giving out a lot of research funding and then it is being used for things that are not going to actually have long-term value, that's a wasted resource. So they are the people that are putting the pressure on people to do things differently, but they're not doing it in this way of sort of post hoc scrutinising what you're doing. They're more in doing it in the sense of sort of saying, you know, you should be working in this way, you should be working much more openly, much more transparently, you need to do studies that meet certain sort of criteria. But it's not so much scrutiny as really just only giving people funds if they do things in a rigorous way, which is I think, a more effective way of doing it rather than continually breathing down their necks. So I think it's soluble. I mean, it's not easy, but I feel very inspired by the fact that when I talk about those issues, it's the young people in the room get it immediately and are really on board with it. It's people my generation that are the problem.
Yes, I want to try to challenge your solution.
Yeah.
You want to go back to self-regulation.
Yeah.
Self-regulation is a problem. Well, just to give a very short example, I used to work in very good universities, and then I found myself at London South Bank University. And my colleagues were telling me, at least we are very good teachers. And I thought they were dreadful teachers when I moved in. So self-regulation is a problem, number one. And number two, who is the self? Who is regulating? I just said there is a problem with academics self-regulating, but in reality, it's the management now who's regulating. And the management, I think, is our biggest problem. If we have proper management, they will try to resolve all the problems you discussed. And they're not even looking into it. If they talk about universities as a business, which is garbage, because they are not accountable to anybody. They don't have shareholders. It's all pretense business, it's not real business. So I'm also a member of CDBU. Don't you think that we should make this a priority, that we start thinking about university governance and then all these other things will follow?
Yes, I mean, so the question is really, you know, the important role of governance, and at the moment how the regulation is really failing us. I mean, I would agree with that, and I think that the way it's unfortunate that REF, which again started as a way of distributing funds, was then started to be used as a management tool, and it was never intended as that. But the fact that it's being used by managers to sort of try and set people goals, and you know, in some institutions you're told that you have to bring in this amount of research income, and it varies depending on your level of seniority, and your career is at risk, and there's still places where that's very much the case. So I think that I can only agree with you that the sort of people that seem to have got their teeth into the REF and are using it in that way, I think are doing, and it's not just they're not doing the right thing, I think they're doing a great deal of harm. I'm not sure how we change that system other than by maybe introducing, I mean, the trouble is this would be yet another evaluation system. If we're going to deal with each problematic evaluation system by having another evaluation system, I don't think that's the answer. But I mean, I would like to see this sort of Sally Hunt idea that we should, I mean, perhaps if we have a REF under the environment arm, if we took very seriously some data on how satisfied staff were. I mean, we've been going on about how satisfied students are, but if we had some figures on casualisation and we had some figures on the extent to which staff were feeling well supported in their jobs and so on, that would perhaps make for a slightly more balanced system.
Are there any final questions before we close? Sorry, boss.
I remember in the 1990s, mid-1990s, when we received, I was a postgraduate student, and my teacher, Julian Bustamines, received a circular document from Hesse. And I was astonished to read that they were, this was an announcement for bids for minority subjects, including Buddhist Sanskrit, Buddhist studies, Sanskrit, and paleography, our own domain, Greek and Latin specifically. And the rationale behind was that as a society, civilized society, we need to maintain these subjects that are endangered, like endangered species. Also because, not only for the intrinsic value in understanding the past and also the present, where we are going as a society, but also because it will be very hard and very costly if these disappear for some years because of this marketization or whatever. This will take decades in order to reach again the level of knowledge and of quality. And I said to myself, I come from Greece, and I came as a postgraduate student here. This is a nation with a vision. Then, all this ethos that I came across, and I admired, and I respected, and I still respect and admire, and it's very hard, was destroyed through this marketization. Instead of collaboration among sister colleges in the University of London, to take our example, federal degrees, the new found way was to introduce competition among fellow scholars, among colleagues that we feel great respect and admiration, in order to pursue our knowledge together and to teach our students, we had to compete. More and more of this tension led to the destruction and the endangering of our academic ethos. The very essence, I think, is in danger. The Council for the Defense of the British Universities was and remains, at least to me and to many other colleagues in this country, as the last bastion, if you like, of this ethos. And I really believe that if the Council for the Defense of British Universities will be successful in its campaign, educating the public, informing also the political world, the House of Lords, I think is more favorably, for some reason, more favorably inclined to listen to our cause. but also the House of Commons, where the decisions are made, but also at the heart of the English society. I came also to realize, this will be the end probably, I don't want to take more of your time, that there is a suspicion among the English nation, not the Scottish, I don't know about the Welsh or the Irish, that academics are not serious people. If, for example, we talk about this academically speaking, it means that it is pure rhetoric sometimes, that it has not application in reality. But as we know, this is not true. So we are battling here with not only political problems with the marketization, and let us not forget who brought the marketization. It was not the Conservatives, I'm afraid. And those who introduced it, that is the Labour Party, came back and said that this was wrong. Am I wrong in mentioning the name of Lord Adonis, who mentioned who was the first who proposed the introduction of fees? And he admitted that he was wrong. So all this information and all this, if you like, discussion, I think should be brought to the fore of English society, so that these people that are suspicious about what academics are trying to do, not only to pursue knowledge, and to create free thinkers and citizens with values, with principles, not only oriented and taking the priority on their self-employability. But what you said before, and my distinguished colleague here, the public good, and as Justin said before he left, I go back to Aristotle in his politics, his discussion, the last chapters that he devoted to public education. And the question posed there for Aristotle and his generation, his society, was, should it be private or public? He opted for the second, because it is a public good. It is not a product to be sold. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that was a comment rather than a
the question is, what are we going to do?
Well,
as the Council for the Defence of the British Universities, that we have taken upon us and we have undertaken this responsibility.
Well, on that note, maybe this is my cue to offer Dorothy an opportunity to sum up if you can, or if you wish to, be daring. Otherwise,
I think...
Well, maybe there are a few words you want to say in conclusion.
No, simply that I think academics do tend to, I mean, certainly I myself, I understood nothing about any of this stuff, and I'd been working in academia for many, many years, and I think we don't really tend to bother with thinking about how the structures that we work within are operating. We tend to, I mean, you just are very pleased that somebody will pay you a salary and that you're doing a job, hopefully, that you enjoy doing, and you get an opportunity, if you're an academic, to really sort of explore subjects that intrigue you in some depth and so on. And I certainly was very unaware of anything about the structures of how institutions operated, and for a long, long time it was all pretty benign. You could do that. You could sort of just trust, if you like, as if there was a benevolent uncle up there who was going to be looking out for your interests as an academic. And I think it just started to very gradually dawn on me that it wasn't like that. I think in Oxford, I think I'm very well protected, and most of us are, because we have a college system. We don't have this central control that can really force us too much to behave one way or another. But I've been deeply shocked at colleagues in other places to see the attempts to control people, which never used to exist. And so I think there has been a shift, but it's important not to, I think we have to have some solidarity, and important that people don't just feel isolated when that happens to them, and that rather that we do have to make the case. But I do feel strongly that we did well with the House of Lords over the passage of the Education Reform Research Bill, Higher Education and Research Bill. We got a lot of support from the Lords, and we achieved very little, though, because Johnson just wasn't going to listen. He wasn't going to change anything. But we have got allies in high places, and I think many of them are people who themselves were at one time involved in universities. And so I think the main thing is to say, sort of perhaps the note to end on is nil desperandum, we should fight back.
Thank you. And I think for myself, the most chilling slide you had was the one that showed the conflict of interest that was implicit in the REF and the TEF coming together. And since we have somebody from the Times Higher, maybe I could do a plug, which is a very good article in this week's Times Higher about the 24/7 University, which I think makes the points about the pressures that are under very, very well. Anyway, on that note, may I thank you again, Dorothy, for coming this way from Oxford and for giving such a stimulating and also very encouraging talk on covering both, as I said earlier on, breadth and depth.